Hello, Internet. My name is Ryan Sesney. I am the director of the gaming track for Jordan Con, and today I have a very special guest. Valerie, if you would introduce yourself.
Hi there, I am Valerie Valdes. I am the author of two novels currently out, Chilling Effect and Prime Deceptions. Both are found family space opera stories. If you like adventure in space, like Guardians of the Galaxy, it's probably some stuff for you. I am also a copy editor, and I've edited a couple of tabletop RPGs and miniature games, including the Epic Legacy Rulebook, the Total Party Kill Handbook, the Trap Compendium, all from C2 Gaming, and the Arena Deathmatch 4th Edition Handbook from Avatars of War.
Hmm. And what is it? That is a very impressive resume in and of itself. But let's start with your novel. Um, Let me see. The first in the series, I believe, is called Chill Effect. Cats in
Chilling Effect,
Space.
yeah, Cats in Space. Actually, hold on, I have one. I'll show you the cover. So Cats in Space, definitely cats on a spaceship. It was sort of the inciting incident in that it was a joke on the whole save the cats approach to introducing a character in which you want to show the main character doing something that is kind and brave and wonderful so that the audience will immediately feel rapport with them. But in this case, the character is introduced immediately trying to trap 20 cats that are cargo on her small cargo vessel, and they continue to escape and cause giant problems for her and her crew.
So this is literally a story about herding cats.
They are unfortunately secondary characters and a very secondary plot line to the main plot line of the book, which is that the spaceship captain finds out that her sister has been kidnapped by an organization called the Fridge, who, well, kidnaps people and then ransoms them back for a lot of money while they're held in cryostasis. And so in this case, instead of money, which she does not have, being a very small potatoes cargo pilot, she has to do horrible odd jobs for this evil organization while keeping it all a secret from her crew, her unsuspecting crew, who is not into doing evil stuff.
No, I get that. And you kind of touched on something that I kind of find uh, interesting about kind of a lot of way that a lot of sci-fi novels are going. Economic woes are kind of a motivating factor for a lot of very good stories out there, and it seems like that's, in a lot of ways affected by, current times, obviously, but what is it? It seems like generally the culture's moving away from kind of the Star Trek, perfect world kind of view of the future. Do you think that is a trend that's going to continue, or is that just, temporary problems due to our current economy?
I mean, I think it is a little column A and a little column B. I think it is a very kind of Gen X and millennial approach right now to fiction. We have a lot of economic anxiety. We've, grown up amidst a lot of different recessions and problems and, sort of seeing the ways that society has, I don't necessarily want to use the term failed, but it's probably appropriate in a lot of ways, frankly. And we find ourselves underemployed or unemployed and having to deal with a lot of very serious economic problems. And so I think that resonates with a lot of people who have grown up amidst all of these different woes. And I think that there are at the same time a lot of authors out there, thankfully, who are doing kind of more hope punk and utopian aesthetics, who are trying to imagine futures that are better than the one that we are on a trajectory for right now, perhaps. And even in my books, for all the economic anxiety that sort of permeates what's going on, I've tried to set up systems of social safety nets and things like that. So there are people who will always slip through the cracks in a world like the one that I've created, but it does still attempt to be a better version of the world that we are in right now and a better version of the trajectory that we're on right now. So it is sort of a combo platter there. But I do think there are a lot of authors, thankfully, who are still working in the utopian model that Star Trek puts forward and trying to envision futures where we don't have these kinds of economic anxieties where we don't have horrifying climate change, woes to deal with. And even in my novels, I like to hope that we have solved climate change problems, because the alternative is really deeply depressing and unpleasant. So it
For
is a
sure.
combo. It is a combo. I think there are authors that are working in all of these kinds of different modes. You have people at one end of the spectrum who are bringing back company towns, and people on the other end of the spectrum who are trying to envision utopia.
Mm. I agree that it's not, how can I phrase it? It's not a unified outlook by any means, but yeah, I was just commenting on some of the more trends that I've been noticing. Even some of the newer Star Trek novels have been more bleak than they have in previous generations, and I just see that as an overall trend. When even Star Trek, which kind of based itself on a utopia to begin with, started to go that way. But moving on, I also wanted to touch on the fact that your novel follows a character who follows the tradition of a space trucker. She's a captain. She's very much like an everyman character,
Mhm.
very relatable.
Yeah.
Um, again, like comparing it to the opposite end of the spectrum. Picard and Kirk literally look down on like kings and presidents from their vaulted positions of high captain, and they were above it all, and there was an arrogance about it that uh, kind of translated strangely. That you're going a very different direction with this and making the character much more relatable.
Yeah, and so that's something that I think, once again, it's kind of like there's a spectrum of stories in sci-fi. You can either have the stories of the very kind of everyman character who is at the bottom of the food chain and either trying to climb it to get towards the top of the food chain somewhere, or you have people who are already on the top. You have stories of, ambassadors and captains of huge battleships and um, royalty, nobility, emperors of space and time, and all that sort of thing. And so having that spectrum does allow for a really wide variety of stories that different people can tell, and stories also, again, of sort of the mobility that's possible or impossible between the ends of that spectrum. And so you'll have characters like mine where she actually is in a position that arguably is more privileged than some other folks, because she does have her own ship, and certainly not everybody has their own ship. You've got people that are living in much greater poverty on a planet or a space station or something like that, who are in much more dire straits. But she does, in the same way that a trucker has their truck and they're doing their thing, transporting their cargo, getting their assignments, driving from point A to point B wherever they need to go. It's sort of like that too. It's you get the cargo from whoever gives you the job, and you take the cargo where it needs to go, and then you get paid. And you hope you get enough work to keep paying the bills, keep the lights on, feed your crew. And certainly when the story starts, things are not going super well, such that even though this horrifying thing has happened to her sister, she ends up getting paid more regularly, which is a really horrifying kind of spot to be in, where you find that, oh, this is actually sort of helping the problems that I was having, even though it has created vast new problems. And that does carry over into the second book as well, in terms of finding a niche for herself and for her crew that allows them to eat better.
When what is it? That's the dream.
Yeah, no, and I think, again, going back to what we were talking about before, I think that is a lot of the sort of social and economic anxiety that a lot of people right now are living with. It's not just how am I going to afford to keep a roof over my head? It's how am I going to afford to feed my family? How am I going to afford to pay my bills? Which bills am I going to be able to afford to pay? What kind of GoFundMe do I need to start this month to be able to keep my phone working, or keep the gas running, or what have you? And so it's something where the escapism that is great about Star Trek, because there is so much of that that is already accounted for. Basically, nobody on the ship is starving to death. Everyone has their uniforms and their job, and essentially they're all paid to the extent that we know that their needs are taken care of, I guess. And it, in some ways, is a very sort of socialist system, because it seems as if everyone's handled. Nobody seems to have any kind of worries, at least on the crew. But That said, this is the other end of the spectrum where people are trying to make ends meet, trying to pay their bills, trying to get work and keep the work consistent. And it is the freelancer's life, which I think the hustle is real, and a lot of us are experiencing it these days in ways that we maybe weren't before. You would get your job and you'd work it for 50 years and then get your solid gold watch and retire, and everything would be wonderful, and you'd do whatever you did in retirement that was delightful. But even when that was the sort of American dream myth and mythology, there were a lot of people that were not living that dream, and those people often didn't show up in sci-fi and fantasy stories, which I think that they did happen. It did happen. It's not to say that it never did, but I think it is much more in the forefront of people's minds today.
To kind of touch on that, it was never really a socialist system per se, but you know, the American dream, as you had alluded to, was you work for one company for 50 years, you have constant,
Mhm.
steady employment, and you got your gold watch at the end, and you went off. I would say that yeah, there, even though it's not outrightly socialism in that it's not the government providing the safety work for you per se, like I think that that kind of expectation was, kind of in the forefront of people's minds when they made things like Star Trek or something. Bringing it back to gaming, the Imperium in Traveler
Mhm.
basically was a very utopian society. If you were in like the Empire, your life was pretty good. I mean, you had like, some problems to deal with, but I mean, basically you paid your taxes. The Imperial Navy would like show up if somebody threatened your planet, and if there was like a natural disaster, they would give you aid, and that kind of thing. It was very, at the same time, it was very utopian in that it gave you like the freedom to basically do whatever you want on your little planet out in wherever,
Yeah.
so you could in theory have full capitalist society or something like that, but as long as you paid your taxes and you kept the law, you and your planet and your society had these like safety nets. So I see that as a very like American idea of like the age that like both these came out of, and I think it's interesting how that utopian like society is evolving in a lot of sci-fi. I don't know. It's
Yeah, yeah, and it's tough because I think that, and this is something that also kind of goes back to RPGs, right? Is so it typically, if you're playing an RPG, chances are that you're not in a utopian system, because otherwise, what are your characters going to do, right? They're going to go out on an adventure. Why? Why aren't they just staying home and hanging out and going into the holodeck and having fun with parties or whatever? Like it's one of those things that building a world in tabletop games, I think a lot of times you want the world to be somehow fragmented, disrupted, challenging for the characters, because that puts them in a place where they want more, they need more, they have either ambitions or needs, literal needs that they need to resolve, and that's why they go out adventuring. That's why they do what they're going to do. And I think that in the past you have games, like Dungeons and Dragons, obviously the standard, where you have this world state with a lot of monsters and evil, and you're the good guys ostensibly, unless you're playing an evil character, and you're going out and you're vanquishing evil, and it's a really cool power fantasy. And certainly I have enjoyed playing. I'm literally playing a game right now with my family. It's Dungeons and Dragons. Never goes away because it's awesome. But even in the context of that game, you have a lot of latitude for stuff that you can do in how you set up the world state, but also just the kinds of games that we have. You went from something like Dungeons and Dragons to stuff like Vampire the Masquerade, which was a much more kind of, Gen X millennial world state of actually everybody is like constantly murdering each other. This is a very dog eat dog world, and survival of the fittest, and vast conspiracy underlying everything to keep mankind in the dark as we all struggle with our blood needs. And so there's a lot of kind of other dramatic stuff that had happened in tabletop games. And then a game that I'm playing right now a lot, which I find deeply enjoyable, is Blades in the Dark. And so that is another world state wherein you are ostensibly at the bottom of the food chain and trying to struggle. You form a gang essentially, in a city where everyone's a gang, including the cops and the nobility, for the purposes of game mechanics. And you are trying to essentially get a foothold in the turf here, make a name for yourself, earn money, and kind of climb your way out of poverty. And so there are a lot of ways to approach that, even within the rule book of that game. But it is still a very bleak world state. The sun is broken, never to come back again.
Oh
And
yeah, and you
yeah.
have what is it, ghosts and what is it?
Yeah.
It's a gothic dystopian. I'm a big fan of the setting.
Oh yeah, no, it's amazing. You have basically these giant electroplasmic walls keeping the ghosts out of your city. And every time someone dies, there are these crows that are released that essentially tell the Ghostbusters where to go get the dead body and the accompanying ghost, because ghosts are a real problem in this game. So, um, and interestingly, as I've been told, the world itself grew out of a different game that the creator was playing in, and essentially a lot of the characters, the NPCs in the game, were PCs in that previous game who broke the sun. And it's like the fact that it kind of, you can have an entire game world that came out of a world that other people were playing in as characters. I don't know, that's just really cool.
That's the evolution of a lot of the lineage for like D&D and games like Traveler, and I know L5R, for instance, they actually compiled the histories based on how the games were like played out in the card game. What is it? Whenever they would like have a con and get like the game together, like whoever would like win that game, it's like okay, so the Scorpion had a giant loss at this one, and it was just like a really fascinating way to develop the histories of the game world. I love that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, those kinds of shared world lore situations are just, they're so deeply cool.
They are. You are the first editor that I've interviewed for one of these, so I wanted to highlight some of your experience and yeah, share some of your opinions and such for our guests. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of what types of editing usually go into this sort of process?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different levels of editing that can happen with these books. I am a copy editor slash proofreader slash line editor. And so what that means is that typically by the time that I get the book, it's already been written, revised, the writers and the upper level editorial department has already kind of overseen what's going on here. And in terms of upper level editorial department, that may just be one person, frankly. It could even be one person doing all of the things. And so you never know what you're going to get in terms of if you're working for a corporation versus if you're working for an indie. And so I'm going to use the same terms regardless because they're doing the same functions, but it may sound very grand, but it may just be one person doing it. But anyway, so you have sort of the upper level editorial department who is controlling things like the tone of it, what kind of stuff, what kind of materials are going into it, whether there's going to be fiction included or not, what the voice is, the style, how things are laid out, all that sort of thing. And you have the writers who are going to be involved in writing all that stuff up to specifications. And by the time that it gets to me, what I'm doing is copy editing, and that involves going through it and making sure that there is consistency in the voice, consistency in the tone, just uniformity throughout, and things like capitalization, punctuation, the use of names, what the level of diction is. I'm also usually looking for typos and errors and problems that can be fixed by me. Then after the copy editing stage, you're usually going to have another proofreader who is ideally looking at the actual pages and how they're laid out, how they're going to be printed, assuming that it is going to be a printed manual as opposed to something that's just online. And that way they can check for, issues in terms of the line spacing or something that gets cut off or looks weird on the page, that if it runs into a picture, if the picture caption is accurate, stuff like that. And so there's also developmental editing, which can occur at the stage before copy editing, in which if you have an editorial department, you bring someone in to take a look at the actual mechanics of stuff, make sure that it plays correctly, make sure that there's not stuff that's too OP or out of whack, make sure that maybe the monsters are not redundant, repetitive, that they're fresh and new, stuff like that. And you can also have what you call targeted expert editing, also known as sensitivity readers, and they will come in and they will check for things like racism, sexism, other ableism, things like that, depending on the content of whatever it is that you're dealing with. And having that extra sort of targeted expert is really useful, especially if you're working with a monster maybe that you have borrowed from a particular culture, which is not necessarily a good idea to do as a general rule, but it's just a way to reach out to people who have experience, whether it's firsthand or secondhand in that particular culture, to just get an extra read to make sure that you're characterizing things in a good and appropriate way, and not doing any harm there. So those are kinds of the different varieties of editors that you can get. And again, as the copy editor, my job is primarily consistency is the watchword there. I'm making sure you don't have errors. I'm fact checking. And so another thing that I'll do is, if like say that I'm writing a module for, or reading rather, a module for D&D 5 Ed, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to try to make sure that everything is in line with the core rule book of D&D 5 Ed, and making sure that there aren't any inconsistencies with those rules, in addition to whatever else is the internal style guide of the company who's putting out the book.
Sure. Um, and what is it? That covers a lot of ground. So let me kind of break this up into pieces here. Now, your specialty is copy editing, so I'm going to focus a little bit more on that. Going back to something you had kind of said earlier, consistency is key. To make this a more hands-on example, let's say I'm doing a RPG set in a historical period, but I'm going to deviate from the known timeline.
Right.
Let's say I'm going to do this in Victorian England,
Mhm.
Blades in the Dark style, but in
Oh, it's not. Blades is a totally different setting, by the way, because it looks very Victorian, but it's not. It's almost Russian in a lot of ways. It's like Russia meets Venice meets, yeah.
oh,
Anyway,
sure,
so
sure, but
yeah,
just hypothetically for
yeah,
this, I'm
yeah. This is Victorian. All right, cool.
this is Victorian England, but halfway through Queen Victoria's rule, they discovered that ghosts were there, and people found ways to put them into machines. So
Mhm.
that drastically changes my history from year X.
Right.
Uh, what is it? When you're going through and looking for consistency,
Mhm.
how are you judging the consistency between basically the world fiction and the history, and how are you basically keeping track of it?
Yeah, so different people have different methods, but the overall copy editing approach is that you create a style guide or a style sheet. And so the style guide, what it does is it collects all of the sort of internal stuff that goes into a particular book or setting. And the style guide has very basic things like capitalization, punctuation choices, fonts, italics, plurals, hyphens, symbols, numbers, basically anything that you're going to want to apply throughout in a consistent way. It is the guide that establishes that. So let's say you would establish, for example, that throughout this book, all names of spells must be capitalized. So that is just a simple example of how you would approach it. So for something that is a consistency thing when it comes to establishing a historical change, shall we say, you would have to work with whoever the writers of the book were in order to establish, and ideally that's probably included in the handbook. So you may not even have to have explicit conversations, because you may be able to just read it and go, okay, here's what they are doing, and here is where the deviation exists, and going forward from there. And so you would create that style guide with that information in mind, and you would try to read forward to ensure that there is consistency with how the things are applied, in terms of how that event played out, how it works within the context of whatever actual time period the game takes place in. Because if you're doing a Victorian thing, presumably it can take place in that Victorian era, but maybe not. Maybe what you're doing is setting that up as the past, and then the game itself takes place in the 20s or something. And so it really just all depends on what the established stuff is within the book, and then you're looking for ways to take that and apply internal consistency based on what's already established. And so if there are places where it seems like it's not being internally consistent, then you would reach out and you would say, hey, or even just comment in the margins, depending on what your relationship is with whoever you're editing for. You say, hey, I noticed that in this section you have gas lamps. Well, would they be electroplasmic lamps at that point because of the fact that you are capturing ghosts? Like, is ghost energy an unlimited source of energy that has been prioritized over gas because it's much easier to access in the context of this setting or something like that? And so those are the kinds of questions you might have in terms of fact checking, because copy editors often, that is a thing that they do, is they will say, this doesn't actually seem to make sense based on what you've established over here. Would it make more sense for you to do it this way? Is a kind of a dialogue between you and the editorial department, basically.
Let me have a follow-up question on the what is it, the style sheet and guide. How much do you think it is prudent to include as far as the math of this setting, this being one of the biggest differences between literature and gaming, generally
So
speaking?
okay, one of the things I edited was for C2 Gaming. It was the Trap Compendium. So the Trap Compendium is an amazing handbook for creating your own homebrew traps, and it does rely on a point system. And at the same time, it's basically just this whole series of, like, triggers and effects, and a trap that's worth this much XP is, you have this many points to spend on including these different kind of variations and things that you can stick into it. And so the challenge there was they also had a list of about 50 pre-made traps. So you could definitely make your own. There was, kind of every different trigger and effect and so on had its own number of points allocated to it. And then they had all of the pre-gen ones that you could use if you just needed to really quick reach for an interesting trap without inventing one yourself. Um, there was so much math in figuring out, okay, did they get the point allocations right on all of these traps? Did they get the levels right? Did they get the XP right? And so they had basically a chart that's, explained, okay, this is how many points and this is the XP, and here are the ranges and so on and so forth. And so part of the job as copy editor was to do all the math of that to make sure that, yes, every item, every element that is listed in the description of the trap, every trigger has the correct, number of points assigned to it based on what was said previously in the book. The total number of points for that trap is accurate based on the number of elements that are included. The XP that is awarded is accurate based on the number of points of the trap. And so, yes, the math, the math is real, and it is part of the copy editing process. It's possible that there are copy editors that don't do math, but I have yet to meet one.
No, what is it? Kind of hard not to count pages. I don't know.
And honestly, checking page numbers is also part of the copy editing process.
I don't know, that's usually like a pet peeve of mine because usually when you're going through the books and like it says, refer to page 17 in this, and I'm like, okay, well, I was looking for effects of poison, and now page 17 is all about like overland travel. That's
Yeah, and these are things that can definitely happen. Like, it's a very common kind of layout issue. Basically, it's like, oh, this should have been on page 17, but it like, the way that the kerning happened, or the text, flowed from one page to the next, and suddenly it got booted to a different page, or they started the page numbering on page 2 instead of page 1, or there's all sorts of things that can happen. And that's why earlier when I was talking about sort of the different levels of editing and when they occur, that proofreading level is really the one that it should be the very last look at the actual pages themselves to make sure that none of that happens, basically. And that's where you check the glossary, the table of contents, and make sure that, yes, everything is lining up in the correct way.
what do you feel are the best programs to basically use to make this easier on multiple stages of this check?
Yeah, and so that definitely, it kind of varies just based on what kind of editing you're doing and when you're doing it at what stage of the process. So, for example, I have had situations where I'm given the Word document and I'm basically just copy editing the text itself at that point. And so, being given the Word document, I'm gonna just, put on track changes and add comments where needed, where it, there has to be a dialogue about whatever the fix seems to be, and go from there. Once you get to the other end of it, so if you're doing something in InDesign, for example, you may be just adding comments. If you're doing it in Microsoft Publisher, same thing. You may just be adding kind of comments instead of literally fixing whatever is going on there, because some, it depends on who you're working with. They may want you to just change the thing and fix it, especially if it's a basic kind of punctuation or grammar issue, or they may want to see what you're doing so that they can fix it themselves. And then when you're getting down to the actual page proofs, that's when you're probably working in something like Acrobat, where you're basically just putting in comments for every time that you find an error. And so it's essentially marginalia. It's the equivalent of having the printed pages and marking them up with a red pen, basically. But thankfully, in our technologically advanced age, we don't really do that anymore. If you're a freelancer, maybe people do. I don't know. I definitely don't. I work 100% digitally at this point. Save the trees.
What is it? Going back to style sheets, though, it's kind of a unique facet in a lot of gaming to where it's like half of a technical manual, and a lot of times people throw in basically game-related terms, like
Mhm.
for instance, your what is it? Your gumption may relate to something that is specific and mechanical to the game that you're doing.
Mhm.
You may not necessarily mean that as somebody would colloquially. Of course, you should probably leave notes about that on what is it? Either the style sheet or the style guide. But
Mhm.
in your opinion, basically, how's the best way to do that? Do you prefer just like a list of terms like at the front, or
I think that the way each manual approaches it is different. If you are starting sort of a from scratch game manual, I think that you can either have the list of terms in the front as a glossary, list of terms in the back as a glossary. You can have stuff defined throughout in different sections as you reach it. So you may have just kind of the introductory section wherein you're talking about player character creation. And so then you're going to talk about whatever the skills and attributes are and stuff like that. And gradually you're going to move into inventory terms, combat terms, maybe spell terms, stuff like that. And just as you go, the new information gets gradually introduced in a contextual way based on how you're trying to explain how the game functions to the characters, or the reader, sorry. And then at the end, then you might have just kind of a summary of all the different definitions, or just a straight glossary linking to the individual pages where everything is defined. And using the terms throughout the text, another thing to consider is how you are potentially going to differentiate them in a way that makes it clear that you're using the technical term rather than the non-technical term. So if you're using something like gumption, well, you may never actually colloquially use gumption in the text anywhere else. It may only ever be referring to the stat gumption, but you may want to capitalize it, for example, because it is a stat or an ability or something like that, just to make sure that it is clear that you are explicitly referencing the thing in game terms and not just in general real world terms. And so stuff like strength, dexterity, constitution, those, strength is probably the most obvious one that will get bandied around just in general ways. But if you're referring it to it in game terms, you may have to capitalize it just to make it stand out more. And then, yeah, it's just a question of how each book wants to approach defining those different terms, whether they're going to do it in the text as you go and then just have the glossary link back to that basically, or whether there's going to be an explicit section defining every sort of specific term that is used in the game in a different way than it's used in real life.
what is it? We're kind of talking about this in kind of a system agnostic way, and
Yeah.
basically anything. But one that always like stood out in my mind a couple of years ago when I was playing D&D with somebody for the first time, they saw movement speed,
Mm-hmm.
and what is it? The way that it's explained in the fifth edition book, basically they say that's your maximum movement.
Mm-hmm.
They don't distinguish between like things that are propelling you other than yourself. So basically, they were under the impression that like they fell at 30 feet, around, and that sort of thing. So basically, they're like, oh yeah, I'll just jump off here, and you got like 2 rounds to catch me before I hit the bottom or something like that. And it was an eye-opening experience for them.
Yeah, no, there's all sorts of kind of and this is more in I guess the game writing side than the editing side, but yeah, you have to take into account how the user experience is going to be, right? That's always kind of the the challenge is you can have something that you think is perfectly clear and wonderful and awesome, and as an editor, I do try to go in and say, okay, who is your target reader here? Is it someone who is familiar with how this works? So for example, if you're editing a module for an existing game, like, okay, somebody has written a 5 ed D&D module. Okay. So then you're assuming that the reader of this 5th ed module knows how D&D works. And so you don't have to explain what is movement speed and how does it work. You already have an expected understanding based on who your audience is for a module. On the other hand, if you're writing an entire game manual, then yes, you may have to be like, okay, this is potentially going to be a person who has absolutely no idea how any of this works. And I really need to make sure that I explain things to them in a way that is clear and understandable. And you kind of have to get down to their level, even if you're up here as the writer, and the editor has to be like, okay, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to pretend I'm a reader, and it's like a QA person. What is the most kind of basic question that might be asked by someone in engaging with this, like movement speed? It's like, oh, is this any movement? Do you climb at the same movement speed? Do you fall at the same movement speed? Do you ride a horse at the same movement speed? And it's like, okay, no, you have to be able to qualify whatever the statements are that are listed in there. And so that sort of almost falls under consistency, but at the same time, it's more of a voice thing. It's like, all right, who are you writing for, and what do they need to know, and how do you need to approach telling it to them? There's a difference between someone who's never played a video game in their life picking up a controller for the first time and trying to figure out a Final Fantasy game versus somebody who has played a bunch of at least, something, some console, and has some idea of how controllers work and how to interface with a fake world.
we had we've been discussing different things with different stages of editing around this, but I think that we kind of skipped over kind of a good introduction for that. So what would you say is basically what kind of editing is good for what point of the development process, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think that when you're developing an entire either new handbook or a module or what have you, the first thing you have to do is write the darn thing. Unfortunately, it's got to get done. And so at the point that it is written, then I would say you bring in first your developmental editor, if you are going to have one, because again, it may just be you. You're the whole team. So the developmental editor may end up being like a beta reader or something like that, just a separate eye on whatever it is that you're doing to tinker with the higher level stuff, like just, is this broken? Is this OP? Is this cool? Is this consistent with whatever the world is? Just that's kind of like your ideas level, right? The developmental editor will come in and be like, are these ideas good? Are they cool? Do they work? Does this function within the system, or does this system work? And so that's the very kind of higher level stuff. They will help you with organization of the data. So does this flow well? Is there more stuff that you need to explain that isn't explained? Ideally, that's what you're going to hash out during that developmental edit, is all that kind of really big picture stuff. From there, I would say if you do have things that require a targeted expert, that's when you want to look for them. When you're starting to basically finalize the text itself, you have to have someone come in and be like, all right, is this portraying things in a way that is not going to have like microaggressions and racist triggers? Is not going to have misogyny in it? Is not going to have ableist triggers? If there are any cultures that you're writing about in the context of whatever it is you're working on, have you had readers come in and take a look at whether you're representing them in a way that is accurate and not harmful? And so that's sort of after the developmental developmental edit phase. You can do it before then, but I would say after, only because within the developmental edit, you may end up changing a lot of stuff anyway. So it's not necessarily worth having that sort of sensitivity read then. After that read, then you want to have your copy editor come in. If you are having like a combo of a copy edit proofread, page proofread, which some people do just for time and money purposes, then you would wait until the actual layout is done, because at that point, then you're going to be checking for the individual stuff. But as a general rule, copy editing is best done before the layout process, because you're catching all the different kind of errors, continuity issues, spelling stuff, all of that, and fixing it before you lay it out is important, because if you fix it afterwards, it may just totally mess up your layout, because of the, something may end up being much longer, much shorter, differently worded, so that it doesn't flow between lines the same way. And so the copy edit usually you want to do when it's still text based, essentially, before it is laid out on the page how it's going to look in the handbook. Then once you do have it all laid out, that's when you want to have a proofreader come in, because what they're checking for at that point is just, are there any accidental errors, essentially, that have transferred in from the copy edited text? Are there any issues with the way that stuff is flowing from one page to another? Have lines been lost, essentially? Because when you're working in that kind of a desktop publishing program, sometimes that is a thing that happens, where, oh, this line got completely cut off, or this got covered up by a picture and you can't read it, or things like that you wouldn't necessarily know until you see it in the actual final proof version. And so the proofreader is the one who is going to come in and check for all of that kind of stuff, not just the spelling, punctuation, whatever the copy editor may have missed, which unfortunately even the best copy editor can miss stuff. It's inevitable. And so having that last level is really useful. But they'll catch a lot of the other, again, the table of contents stuff, the glossary pages, all of that, all those little things that can happen when you're transferring the text into the final page layout. That's when you want to have that proofreader come in and look for that stuff.
As you've named like several stages of this, you had said that especially like different size companies do this differently. Some of this may be done more or less by the same person. So it's a little bit more of a back and forth process. What do you what do you feel is prudent, as far as like if you are in a position where you are the only editor working on this, as far as like focusing on your current task? Would you start to like, delve into like the copy editing when you're, at the beginning of the process, or would you necessarily, not waste your time because, it's going to be three more revisions before you're ready for it?
Yes, you have literally just said the thing. That is like, you have answered the question, because yeah, basically, if you're working by yourself, if you're kind of a one or two person house, and you're putting everything together essentially alone in the dark, it's a lot like writing a novel, right? Where you are your own first reader, writer, editor, and everything. And so you are probably going to go through multiple revisions of your own thing in order to hone it, tailor it, get it how you want it to be, before you're going to kick it out to anybody else. And so usually what I would say is, before you start paying money for something, which is what you're going to have to do to have a copy editor, you want to make it the best version that it can be without getting that outside assistance. And so definitely you don't want to kick the first draft to a copy editor unless you want to pay a copy editor multiple times to go over your draft. And if you are made of money, I guess that's cool. And help stimulate the economy with all of your ill-gotten gains. But otherwise, if you're not, like a lot of the rest of us, yeah, you want to wait until you have what you consider to be essentially the final version, as good as you can make it, and that's when you then bring in your copy editor to check it out and make sure it's cool. And again, if you have other levels of editing that can go on before that, beta readers are a good option if you can get them, just to have something that, even if it's not a paid developmental edit from someone on the outside, and even if you don't have an editorial department that has those different kind of layers of people who are going over the text, just getting it to as final version as you possibly can before the copy edit is definitely the ideal.
And for a smaller scale project, because, quite frankly, how can I phrase this? The vast majority of people, at least that I've dealt with, tend to work on smaller scale publishing houses,
Mhm.
or it's a basically a self publishing situation. How does the playtest fit in?
Okay. So I unfortunately have never been involved in the playtest part of the process, but I would assume that it probably comes, I would say probably before the copy edit, honestly, just because that's still in the mechanics portion where you're trying to finalize stuff. And to me, all of the edits that, the fact checking, the line editing, the copy editing, the proofreading, to me, all of that should come after you have settled all of that mechanical stuff down. That should come when you are basically pretty sure that everything is in its as final a version as it can be. And the copy editor's job is just to make sure you didn't mess anything up, basically.
But I did want to, what is it, go back and highlight where can we meet you, follow you, talk to you on your various social media platforms.
Yes. So I am most frequently found on Twitter. You can find me there at Valerie Valdes, and that is with an S. I'm also valerievaldes.com or candleandsunshine.com, and both places go to the same website. So for your own convenience, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, but much less frequently on those platforms than on Twitter, where I tend to post about not just my books and other people's books and cool stuff, but also the just bizarre things that my children do. Like yesterday when my daughter decided she needed to have a character sheet too, and so she made her own character sheet with lots of dots. We were playing D&D, there are no dots, but she needed dots on her character sheet. So she's 3 for
I see.
context.
And where can we find some of your both your novels and as well as some of the games and things that you've edited?
Yeah, so my novels are pretty much at major retailers everywhere. So, wherever you buy your books, and if you have an indie bookstore that is your fave, then you can ask them to just order it for you, and they will definitely be happy to. But yes, 2cgaming.com has the manuals and adventures that I have helped work on, and avatars-of-war.com has the arena deathmatch course set with the manual, and that one is miniatures wargaming. Oh yeah, no, it's a really cool game. I mean, it very much takes the gladiator style approach and codifies it into a war game, and so it is a miniatures war game, and it has really cool miniatures that you can buy. You can also, there are apps that you can use, there are cards that are involved. It's basically just a really cool system, and you're playing as this kind of avatar of an existing power who is representing in the arena and being awesome and cool. And there's all these different like crowd mechanics and beasts, and just it's a lot of neat stuff.
It was an interesting take because when I picked it up, I thought it would first glance, I thought it would be more or less focused on the combat elements and all that, and I was delighted with all the crowd mechanics. That was one thing that I was
Yeah.
like, wow, it's you could do this as like professional wrestling very easily by just changing.
Yes. Yeah, no, it is. There is just so much cool stuff intrinsic in that system. Yeah, so definitely check that out. And then 2C Gaming is primarily fifth ed D&D related stuff, but they have the Total Party Kill Handbook. I really love because what it has is a bunch of different modules, basically, and adventures that it explicitly explains ways that you can scale them to make them easier or harder based on your player group. And I think that is extremely useful, honestly. Just saying like, okay, well, if you want to add, if you want to make this harder, you can add one of these enemies, and this additional trap, for example. Or if you want to make it easier, you instead of these enemies, make it one less of this, take this one out entirely, and go from there. And it is intended so that you can essentially create a scenario where your party will wipe. I mean, that's why it's called the Total Party Kill Handbook. And it also includes ways to change the flavor of things. So, for example, even if the adventure takes place in a desert environment with a very particular sort of desert themed set of monsters, they will say, if you want to instead have this happen in tundra, then you just switch from this monster to this monster, but keep the same stat block. And so it's very cool how it builds in that sort of flexibility into all the different adventures that it is offering going for you. And then I, again, can't talk up the trap compendium enough just because I find it to be utterly delightful. And some of the traps that it creates are just diabolically funny and terrible.
I am a sucker for trap books. What is it? One of my favorite is Grimm's Tooth, which is just pure sadism.
Yes. Yes, it's always I am very lawful good by nature, and so every time that I encounter these things in the wild, or again in this case I was editing it, it was just like, wow, people are so devious about torturing these poor players with, illusory things where it's like, if you didn't notice this, then this is there was one where it was basically like, you know, there's like a small gap that it looks like you could just jump over it and you're fine. And if you do jump over it, turns out on the other side there's a springboard that will launch you into the hidden spike trap in the ceiling. And it was like, are you kidding me? What? Who thinks of this stuff? Oh, these guys, yeah. And so they're very cool, thoughtful dudes who work on that stuff, and I'd love to boost them. That's 2C gaming.
My favorites are always like you'll put one in the middle of the room and you can just like walk past it. But like if, the players get like, why is there this big red button in the middle of
Yes.
the room?
So you're giving them a choice. Or
Those are
mimics. Yeah, mimics are the other ones where it's just like, here's an entire room full of mimics. Guess which ones are the mimics? And you're like, oh, it's just a bedroom. Why are half of these things not real? Anyway.
yes, good times, good times. Uh, but anyway, time is against us here, so I will end here and say happy gaming.
Happy gaming.